This week I was in just south of Berlin and got to speak at a Word of Life summer camp. They call it an English camp, so it's all German kids that come, but we speak English the whole time, and so it's kind of an opportunity for them to practice their English and hear God's Word in English and so forth. And had a great time. I took a couple pictures I wanted to show you of the time that we had. This was the camp. I think there were 21 campers and then several counselors and things. So this is right before the session on Friday that I spoke at. In the back there, you can kind of see the counselors. A lot of them were from Brazil, from Word of Life in Brazil. And so it was fun to spend the week with them. On the top there, you can see we played we played a lot of games together. They actually have this game they call Jugger, which is like medieval jousting, basically. I mean, they've got all these weapons and things that they go and they have this organized it's kind of like capture the flag with medieval weapons. It was a lot of fun. And then we had times of worship often. Even it's kind of on a beach, and so they had a time of worship on the beach, was a lot of fun. When I wasn't doing this or wasn't taking part in the camp, I was reading because I'm right near the end of one of my seminary courses. So I had a lot of reading to do. So I was either out playing with the campers or in my room by myself reading. And so it was a great week. As I was reading this week, I came across this text that I put on the back of your bulletin or your handout from Tim Keller. There's a book called Center Church, where he's trying to, it says Center Church doing balanced, gospel-centered ministry in our cities. And so he was talking a passage that really, as we look at Philippians chapter 2, that really caught my attention. I'm just going to highlight some things from that passage that's on the back of your handout. You can take some time. I would encourage you to take some time to read it in its entirety. But he's talking about contextualization. In other words, taking a timeless, unchanging message and putting it in language and presenting it in a way that each culture understands it in their context. So at the beginning he says, a message is contextualized if it is adapted into a new language or culture so it is understandable, and yet it maintains its character and original meaning in its former language and culture. Here I'm proposing that Christians themselves must be contextualized letters of the gospel. In other words, we will have an impact for the gospel if we are like those around us and yet profoundly different and unlike them at the same time. And I really like the way he put that, to be like the culture and unlike the culture, both at the same time, because usually we kind of get bent one way or the other. Either we become totally like the culture and there's no difference, or we become totally unlike the culture to a point where they can't relate to us. So listen to how he kind of explains that. So first of all, Christians must be like their neighbors in the food they eat and clothes they wear, their dialect, general appearance, work life, recreational and cultural activities, and civic engagement. They participate fully in life with their neighbors. We're not calling Christians to a fort or a camp where we kind of get behind the walls and we look over the walls to those people out there. Christians should also be like their neighbors with regard to excellence. That is, Christians should be very good at what others want to be very good at. They should be skilled, diligent, resourceful, and disciplined. In short, Christians in a particular community should, at first glance, look reassuringly similar to the other people in the neighborhood. This opens up non-believers to any discussion of faith because they recognize the believers as people who live in and understand their world. It also eventually gives them a glimpse of what they could look like if they became believers. I thought that was really helpful. And then he says, jumping down, second, Christians must also be unlike their neighbors. In key ways, the early Christians were startlingly different from their neighbors. It should be no different for us today. Christians should be marked, and then he highlights integrity, generosity, hospitality, sympathy, forgiveness, chastity, responding to adversity. I want us to think about that we should be like our neighbors and unlike our neighbors. Often when we talk about being Christians, the way we're unlike our neighbors are usually superficial. So what we do on Sundays makes us different than our neighbors, or the clothes we wear make us different from our neighbors, or especially in the army, if you don't curse, you're different from everybody else in the army. And while cursing has some moral substance to it, it's not a very deep moral issue. It's pretty cursory. I'm getting myself in trouble here. There are deeper things than whether you curse or you don't curse, as far as who you are, your ethics, and your character. And I thought Keller really did a good job of saying Christians shouldn't stand out because they don't fit into the culture. You shouldn't be able to look at a Christian walking down the street and be like, that must be a Christian, because look how weird they look. Look how unlike everybody else they are. I don't think when God calls us to be salt and light, that's what he's talking about, that we ought to be the weirdest people in the neighborhood. I think we ought to look like and fit in. Hudson Taylor went to China. And one of the things Hudson Taylor did when he went to China, which was back in the, I think, 1800s, is all the other missionaries continued to wear their English Western clothes as they ministered to the Chinese. And Hudson Taylor was one of the first missionaries who kind of practiced this idea of contextualization. And he put on Chinese clothes, and he cut his hair, and he had the ponytail. If you remember old pictures from China, he had the ponytail coming out the back of his head. And the rest of the missionaries said, what are you doing? You can't do that. That's unbiblical. That's unscriptural. And he said, it doesn't matter what I'm dressed like. It doesn't matter if I'm trying to show them the gospel in their culture, in their way. And I think we're getting to a time in our world where we need to be missionaries to Germany. We need to be missionaries to the army and to America. It needs Christians to have a mission mindset of how can I approach the people around me and adapt my life to fit in with them so that they can hear the real message of the gospel. And I thought what he highlighted, what we should be different, is once you get past the surface issue and really get down to who we are, that's where we ought to be startlingly different. When he highlights things like integrity, generosity, hospitality, sympathy, forgiveness, chastity, adversity, those are the things that people ought to say, you look like me and you talk like me mostly, except, you kind of talk like me, and you go to barbecues like I go to barbecues, but you're profoundly different at some of the core parts of life. You do life differently than me. You view positives and negatives different than me. So as we come to Philippians chapter 2, I thought that passage from Keller's book was a great springboard. Philippians chapter 2, we're going to start in verse 12. He says, therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. Do you see this like and unlike? We're in the midst of it, we're among them, but we're different than them, profoundly different. Among whom, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. So I want to highlight some of the things that I think Paul is pointing out, and especially the way it corresponds to what Keller was writing. Keller writes that we should be like and unlike our communities. Similarly, Paul writes that we should live in the midst of our communities and live among our communities, but that as we live in the midst and among them, we should shine as lights. So then the question is, what about us should shine as lights? What is it that should mark us off from the darkness? What is it that should illuminate us? And sometimes in an attempt to contextualize or an attempt to become relevant, we think, well, the less we emphasize God's word, the more we can connect with the people around us. And Paul puts it exactly opposite. Paul says, if you want to shine as lights, the thing you have to do is to hold fast to the word of life. If you think about us being the lamp and the light bulb, the word of life is like the cord that connects us to the energy in the wall, which let's say is God. So us shining as lights is dependent on the cord that connects us to the electricity. If we want to shine as lights, as God's lights, we have to, as Paul says, hold fast to the word of life, which I think is so cool because I was at Word of Life camp studying this passage where Paul says, hold fast to the word of life, which is where they get the name for their ministry, the name for their camps. As we hold fast to the word of life, it begins to change us in deep ways, in really substantial ways. Obviously, there will be surface changes. There are words that I'm just not going to say that my soccer buddies say. There are drinks that I'm not going to drink that my soccer friends drink. There are surface things that I will be different. But we as Christians, I think a lot of times we kind of pride ourselves on these surface differences, and we don't realize that at the core, we think the same way they think. We value the same things they value. We prioritize the same things they prioritize. There's no core difference a lot of times between the church and the world. It's just that we kind of cover our core with this veneer of, yeah, but I don't do this and I don't do that and I wear these clothes and I go to church on Sunday. So that's see how different I am than you? But you really dig down deep and a lot of times we're the same. And the word of life, when we hold fast to the word of life, it doesn't just change where we go and what we drink and how we dress. It changes much more deeply who we are and how we view the world. So let me show you 3 ways, just even in this little passage, that it changes who we are.
Do it.
I will. Thank you, Ben. Let's start at the end, actually. Look at 17 and 18. Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. Now you think about what makes most people rejoice, Christian or non-Christian. And this is the problem. Christian or non-Christian, what makes most people rejoice is when good things happen to them. When I know that someone is going to bless me or take care of me or give me or provide for me, when I get a tax return that is several $1,000s, when I get a pay raise, when I get a promotion, usually we're glad and we rejoice when something good happens to us. But at a very deep level, what Paul is saying is when you hold fast to the word of life, you don't stop rejoicing at those things. I think every human being rejoices when they get a check in the mail. That's just a universal thing. But we also rejoice when other people don't rejoice. When other people complain or other people would argue or other people would fear and tremble, we rejoice and are glad when we are poured out. It teaches us to rejoice when we are poured out as an offering of faith. One of the most commonly memorized verses in the New Testament, Romans 12:1. Hopefully that rings a bell in some of your heads. I beseech you, it depends on what version you have, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a what? Exactly. As a living sacrifice. And what Paul is saying is, Philippians, as I watch you lay down your lives as a living sacrifice, it makes me rejoice. It makes me so glad. And in fact, one of the things that they would do in sacrifices is you'd have a meat sacrifice or an offering, and then you'd also would pour a drink offering kind of on top of that or beside that, and the drink would hit the fire and immediately would evaporate and would become smoke, or what's it called? Not smoke, vapor, and would go up. And he's saying, as you are laying down your lives, and I watch you become living sacrifices. I rejoice and I'm glad in that. And what I see God doing is God is pouring me out onto the fire, and I am I am figuratively being evaporated. My life is going up in steam day by day, and I rejoice in that. Now that is a deep core issue of how do you respond when God evaporates your life? When God pours you out in ministry to other people? When God asks you to lay down and die on the altar, what is your response to that? That's a substantial difference, because naturally, in our flesh, no one rejoices at that. No one thinks, this is so great, my life is being used up. This is so great, my energy is being spent for their good. This is so fun. But Paul says, as we hold fast to the word of life, we rejoice to be poured out for other people. We rejoice to see them sacrificed and to see them lay down their lives as living sacrifices. It causes us to rejoice in different things. But then he goes on and it says, it not only causes us to rejoice at different things, it causes us to fear and tremble about different things. Go back to verses 12 and 13. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And that can be a difficult sentence, because Paul is like the apostle of we don't work for our salvation. If there's anything that Paul has tried to communicate, I mean, we looked at Galatians where over and over he's trying to warn Christians, you do not work for your salvation. So now we get to this passage and he says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And we're trying to fit that into the theology that we're learning. What does Paul mean to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling? Verse 13, it's almost like he wants to make sure we don't go down the road of, okay, we have to work for our salvation. So he says, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. And I think that's part of where the fear and trembling comes in. The knowledge that God is at work in us. Think about, I know some of you are soldiers. Imagine if you were doing your job and a 4-star general came and said, I want to work beside you. I want to help you do your job. All of a sudden there'd be this intense pressure. I want to do this right. I want to do this as good as I have ever done this. You don't sloppily be like, well, the book says we're supposed to do this, but I don't usually do that. And I usually do this. And they say this is important, but I never worry about that. When you know this 4-star general is taking his or her time to work beside you and say, I want to work with you. Show me what you do. Show me how I can work with you to accomplish your mission. I'd imagine the same it would be for me if Tim Keller, for instance, came to High Point and said, I want to work beside you. I want to help you at High Point, Pastor. All of a sudden, he's somebody I really respect, somebody I've learned a lot from, and I would be under intense pressure of like, oh boy. I'd be scheduling extra meetings during the week, and we'd be doing things we've never done before at High Point because I want to make sure Tim thinks I'm doing a good job. And the pressure here is that Paul says, it's not Tim Keller, it's not a general that's working beside you. It is God himself who is working inside of you according to his good pleasure. And there ought to be an appropriate fear and trembling that comes with that. Not of saying, I think God's going to send me to hell if I don't do this. But the fear and trembling of saying, I can't believe God himself is working in me and on me. I can't believe that God himself is taking the time and energy to work on me, and I want to make sure if God's working on me, that I'm working just as hard, that I am engaged and that I am doing my very best to work with God for my sanctification. The other part of that, do you remember what Paul says later on in verse 16? It says, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. It seems like Paul always had this appointment on his mind. that there is a day of Christ coming. If you look, this is already the third time in 2 chapters. He says it in chapter 1, verse 6. He says it in chapter 1, verse 10. Now he says in chapter 2, verse 16, there's the day of Christ is coming. The day of Jesus Christ is coming. The day of Christ is coming. And so Paul lives with this anticipation of knowing there's this day that I'm going to stand before my God, my Savior, the one who gave his life for me. And I'm going to say, thank you for saving me. This is what I did with the salvation that you gave me. Hebrews 2 says, Hebrews is filled with 3 or 4 serious warning passages where it's like the author is trying to shake you and get your attention. And in chapter 2, he says, make sure you don't drift away. And I love that phrasing. Make sure you don't drift away from what God has done for you. As Christians, we rarely just rebel and say, I don't care, God. I don't want it. I don't care what you did for me. I'm living for myself. We don't rebel, but we do drift. Where today, I just care a little less than I did yesterday. And tomorrow and the day after, I stop reading my Bible each day. I stop spending time with God in prayer. And then I stop plugging in to a body of believers where there's other people encouraging me and keeping me accountable. And I begin to drift away from what God has done for me. And then in verse 3 of chapter 2, he says, make sure if God did not spare the angels, make sure that we do not neglect so great a salvation. And I think that's where the fear and trembling comes in. That God is at work in me, and I don't want to drift away, and I don't want to neglect such a great salvation. So it teaches us to rejoice at different things than the people around us rejoice at. It teaches us to tremble and fear different things than the people around us tremble and fear. And then the last one, it teaches us to stop complaining and arguing. Verse 14, do all things without grumbling or disputing or complaining or arguing. We Americans have, maybe Germans too. I mean, I don't know if we have the corner on it. Yes, Germans too. Have perfected the art of complaining and arguing. You know, the Jews were pretty good at it back in the Old Testament. I think it's called murmuring in the Old Testament usually. And we've figured it out. We've got it down to an art of how to complain and how to argue. And Paul is saying that is one of the substantial things that when everybody else in the office or everyone else in the neighborhood is complaining, Christians ought to be different. They ought to notice a difference. Instead of joining in or leading the pack, we ought to be different than our neighbors in that way. And when unbelievers visit a church and kind of become part or get to know a church community, they ought to see a marked difference between the way a church community relates to each other and the way a work community relates to each other or a neighborhood community relates to each other. People ought to look around and say, what's wrong with you people? Why does no one in this church complain? Why are none of you arguing with each other? But you don't have to look very far in church history or church culture to see that's simply not true. Churches complain as much as workplaces complain. And churches argue with each other as much as workplaces argue with each other. Therefore, we are failing to be different than the people we're around. We're at our very core, we respond to people the same way unbelievers do. We do not shine as lights. It says it teaches us to stop complaining and arguing. And then you go back and you see what he's been building up to. Back in chapter 127 that Pastor Keith preached to us last Sunday. Let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or if I'm absent, I may hear of you that you're standing firm in one spirit with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. There's this emphasis that in the church we ought to have one spirit and one mind. And we ought to together be striving, fighting for the faith of the gospel. There's so many illustrations as we watch the Olympics of a group of people striving side by side for the same goal. Where a group of people come together and say, we're all going to work toward the same goal. We're all going to work together to do the same thing. And you see these rowing people, and all on the exact same beat. They're pulling with all their might. Now, what if one of them said, you know what, I don't like that beat. I want to work on my own beat. And so he starts bumping into the person leaning back in front of him, and his oar starts hitting other people's oar, and then they start complaining and arguing. And that must be a picture of what God sees when he sees the church. Like, why can't you all just get on the same beat and work together for the same goal? You have the same spirit. Look in chapter 2. If there's any encouragement in Christ, verse 1, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Paul is painting this picture of a group of Christians who come together and who say, what we're trying to do is more important than what I'm trying to do. The goal we're headed for is more important than my personal goals. And so I will lay aside my own preferences because what we're trying to accomplish together is great and is worthy of my life being laid down. And I rejoice when I can lay my life down for the faith of the gospel. Keller in this book was highlighting the difference between institutional church and movement church. And he was highlighting that when the church is a movement, then people are marked by much more flexibility. Because really, we just want to get this done. And so if your way works or if my way works, whatever works to get us to the goal is what we're going to go with. But as a movement becomes institutionalized, then we start to set down rules, and people start to get used to certain traditions. And so now it's more like, well, we've always done it this way. Now you're coming along with this new idea, and you're coming along trying to change things, and you want to do it a different way. And it's not what gets us to the goal that's important anymore. It's what I am used to that's important, or what I've always done that's important. Paul is calling us to have a mentality that we have a goal, and anything and everything that gets us to that goal, I will adjust to. I will give up my preference. I will give up my song styles, or I think Pastor Keith mentioned, the color of the carpet, the time of the services. I will change so that we can achieve the goal, where we all get on the same page and we all go the same direction. That's what the church is called to be. So it teaches us to stop complaining and arguing because we have the same spirit, the same mind, the same love, and we're fighting side by side for the same goal. Is that not a beautiful picture? Is that not a church that you would want to be a part of? I want to be part of a church like that. I want us to be a community that is that laser focused on what God has called us to do. And then Paul doesn't just leave it abstract, because he talks about rejoicing and trembling and not complaining and not arguing. But it's easy to say, well, yeah, those are good things. Those are good ideas. But he's already given us Christ as an example of what that looks like. To give up his rights as God and to become a servant. And then he gives us more examples. I want to read 12 to 30 with you. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to... I'm in chapter 1, sorry. Verses 19 to 30. I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. This is Paul, and sometimes I think we romanticize the early church like they did everything right. They were just a bunch of on-fire Christians who always got it. And we 21st century Americans, we just can't do it right. But Paul is saying, as I look around at the Christians around me, I've got no one else. So I'm sending you Timothy because I have no one else who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. They all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth. How as a son with a father, he has served with me in the gospel. I hope, therefore, to send him just as soon as I will see how it will go with me. And I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also. So he says, Timothy, I'm sending Timothy with this letter. And I want to tell you, Timothy is someone who actually lays down his life for the gospel. Timothy is someone who cares about you more than he cares about himself. This is the kind of person I'm talking about when I talk about someone who rejoices in the right things and who trembles at the right things and who doesn't argue and complain. I'm sending you Timothy, and I want you to watch him. I want you to honor him. And then he says, I have thought it necessary also to send you Epaphroditus. Probably what's happening here is Epaphroditus, we find out in chapter 4 that the church at Philippi sent a gift to Paul in prison. We talked about that a little bit, that it was your relatives and friends' job to take care of you while you were in prison. So the Philippians most likely sent Epaphroditus with a gift, and it seems like they sent Epaphroditus and said, we want you to stay there and take care of Paul. So you work to get things to give to Paul. You be there to serve Paul in our place. And now Paul is sending Epaphroditus back, and the worry is, if we sent you to take care of Paul and Paul's sending you back, how bad did you mess up that Paul doesn't even want you there anymore? What is wrong with you that Paul said, you know what, I'm better off without Epaphroditus than if he stays? So Paul's trying to write to make sure, hey, I'm sending Epaphroditus back, but it's not because he was no help. It's not because I didn't appreciate his service. So this is what he says, I have thought it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother, my fellow worker, my fellow soldier. Glowing references of who he is. And your messenger and minister to my need. For he has been longing for you all and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill. He was near to death. But God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. Just a little side note. This is a neat little picture at the human side of Paul. In chapter 1, you remember him talking about death and saying, I might die, and if I die, I'm fine with that. It means I get to go to heaven. If I don't die, it means I stay here on earth. It is better for me to die than to stay here, but I'll probably stay here. That's kind of like the theological Paul, giving a theological perspective on death. And it's easy to think he was just this cold, like, death doesn't bother me, I don't care, die, not die, it's just heaven. But here we see this human side of Paul saying, Epaphroditus almost died, but God had mercy. And I'm thankful that God had mercy because when God saved Epaphroditus' life, he saved me from sorrow upon sorrow. So we kind of see that he's not just this robot who says, I don't care about death. Death doesn't mean anything. It does affect him. Death does have a sorrow that it brings with it. So where were we? Verse 28. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy, and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. So Paul specifically mentions Timothy and Epaphroditus as examples of people who are shining as lights. And that got me thinking. It's important that we honor people. It's important that we highlight. And sometimes we're good at beating ourselves up. Even this sermon, talking about what the church usually looks like and how the church complains and how the church often argues. But there is a lot of beautiful things that happen at High Point. And as a pastor, I get to be involved and see probably more than most people all the different things that happen, all the different people who lay down their lives as sacrificial offerings for the faith. We have a pastor appreciation time of the year, but we don't have a deacon appreciation time of the year. And I thought this would be a good time to just remember and thank the deacons that God has given us. Josh Lucchese is serving in the sound booth right now. And Josh spends hours taking care of multimedia needs at High Point. especially when Deanna was deployed. I can't tell you how many hours his girls sacrificed, entertaining themselves and playing with things. Josh would bring them. Sometimes they'd have a movie, or sometimes they just have toys or books, and they would play by themselves while Josh, hour after hour after hour, serves us without anybody seeing it. And as a church, as Paul's saying, Timothy and Epaphroditus, these are men who lay down their lives. These are men that you need to know are doing what I'm asking, are doing what I'm calling for. I, as a pastor, want to say our deacons, Josh and then Brad Joy is another one. Brad actually is home with Emily this morning. And it's just a neat example because he filled out a piece of paper with about 12 different things for Julie and said, these are things that need to be done since I'm not going to be at church. And a list. And Julie said, I didn't know he did all of this stuff. And I was looking over the list and saying, yeah, I didn't know he did all this stuff either. But just week after week, without letting people know, without calling attention, both Josh and Brad serve the office of a deacon, which means a servant. They are servants to our church. They rejoice in laying down themselves for the good of us. And I want you, Josh, to know, and Brad, if you're watching, or send greetings, that we as a church are so grateful for your service, for the way you serve us as a body. And then there are several ladies that serve our church. Daylin oversees our children ministry. Whitney leads our music ministry. And Julie leads our hospitality and meals and all of those things. And then the name is Jada, serves up the nursery and coordinates our nursery ministries. These are ladies that week after week after week spend hours serving us and taking care of us and making sure that what we need as a body is provided for us. And we as a church are blessed because of what they do week after week after week. So Daylin and Julie, who are here this morning, thank you so much for what you do for our body. Thank you for the way you lay down your lives to serve us. We watch you, we see you, and you give us an example, like Timothy and Epaphroditus, of what we need to be doing and how we need to be serving. And then there's one more person that is such a huge blessing to me. By the way, one of the reasons it's difficult or awkward to start thanking people is because, on one hand, you don't want to put people up on a pedestal. The church is always about humble service. And sometimes as we recognize people to thank them, we're not saying that these people are perfect. We're not saying that these people have got it down spiritually. Every single one of us, from the pastor to somebody who's their first time here, every single one of us fails and has weaknesses and has things that we're still working on. The second thing is, once you start recognizing people, it's like, man, I should also mention them and I should also mention them. And so I'm intentionally leaving people out. And if you're offended that I leave you out, you need to go back to Philippians chapter 2. Because the whole idea is that we do this humbly, that we don't do this for recognition. So there, I've got an escape clause. If you come to me offended, I'm just going to read chapter 2 with you. But someone who has been so inspiring to me, especially the last 6 months, is the other person back there in the sound booth, Neil Castleberry. He has this heart of, I'm going to find ways to make other people's lives better. So he looks for things, how he can help. I don't think any of the things he's doing, I mean, he has formal ministries like serving in the sound booth this morning, but he has about 5 little things that he does that I have never asked him to do. As far as I know, no one has asked him to do, but he's looked around and he says, you know what, someone could do that and that would help. And so he takes that on as one of his little responsibilities. And then he looks and finds something else. You know what, someone could do that and that would help. And then he takes that on as a responsibility. Where when Neil leaves, if God takes him somewhere else, we're going to have this little book of things Neil found to do that now we're going to have to find someone else to do because we depend on them now. We all benefit from them now. There have been more than a few days that I've come here just to grab something at church or to do some work. My office is at home, so I don't work from church. I'll come here and Neil will be outside weeding on a Tuesday at 10 o'clock. And I'm thinking, we don't have a church day. Like, this isn't an organized church cleaning day. Why is someone here working at church when it's not a church work day? It's so shocking to me. I'm not used to it. So Neil, thank you for your service to us as a church. I know you've told me before, don't talk about me, don't mention it. I'm stealing your rewards from heaven. You can't get any in heaven because I'm just giving you your rewards right now. We appreciate it. We appreciate what you do for us as a church. It's beautiful to be part of a body where people are serving each other, where people want to serve each other. And I want to encourage us to be intentional about rejoicing when we get to lay down our lives. Keith mentioned this verse from chapter 1. Verse 29, it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. That word granted is charis, which means grace. It is a grace gift from God. So we talk about what are the gifts of the Spirit, and we, preaching and teaching and administration and mercy and hospitality. And Paul is saying one of God's grace gifts is that you don't only get to believe in Jesus, but he's giving you the grace gift that you get to suffer for Jesus. Praise the Lord. Rejoice in that. Tremble at the idea that God himself is working inside of you, that God is at work. And you get to and are called to work with him, to join him. And when your mouth produces complaining and when your tongue goes to arguing, which this week my tongue went to arguing, and I had to bite my tongue and say, no, I'm not going to argue about this. As long as the mission is accomplished, it doesn't matter if it's my way or someone else's way. What I want is for us to strive side by side for the faith of the gospel. So bite your tongue and think about what's more important. You winning the argument, you getting your way, or us as a church working together for the faith of the gospel. Pray with me, please.